We're joined by Kenneth Lieberthal. You're with the Brookings Institution. You've been talking here in Singapore about US-China relations. Professor Lieberthal, what is the current state of US-China relations?
I think wide-ranging, basically stable, quite effective overall, but with a lot of big issues on the agenda. The big change is that we now have global issues, climate change, the global economic crisis, global issues in proliferation on our common bilateral agenda. That marks a new development in US-China relations, really, and we're kind of getting accustomed to how to deal with each other on those big issues.
Trust is at the heart of the relationship, and it doesn't seem as though there has been much trust between the two.
If there's a big failure in 30 years of US-China diplomatic relations, I think it's the failure to develop mutual trust, not about how we're handling immediate issues, that we do quite well on, but rather over each side's long-term intentions toward the other. And I think at that level there's still a lot of distrust in both directions.
Even without trust, can the two work together?
You can work with each other, but anyone who's ever bought a house knows the difference between trusting the other side of the transaction and not trusting them. If you don't trust them, there are a lot more things that you need to nail down, and you're willing to take a lot less risk to make the overall relationship work. So we do a tremendous amount with China. In almost every major part of our government, we have interactions with China on a regular basis. So certainly the inadequate trust doesn't prevent a lot of activity together and a lot of cooperation. But it does exact a very substantial price, I would argue, overall on the quality of the relationship and what we're able to accomplish.
The trade imbalance is also a major irritant for the US. US companies are complaining that local companies are getting unfair advantages through state subsidies, state help. And we had GE CEO Jeff Immelt complaining that it doesn't look as though China wants foreign companies, multinationals, to succeed there.
Well, the Chinese have followed a strategy of development that has been relatively open to foreign investment and relatively active in playing in the international trade waters, compared with Japan, for example, that really prevented foreign investment in the Japanese domestic economy, even as they followed a very mercantilist international trade policy. Having said that, there's no question but that the Chinese government does a vast array of things across the board to promote the interests of Chinese enterprises. And there is no question but that the trade balance with the United States is very skewed in the direction of a U.S. trade deficit with China. The reasons for that are complicated, but among those are the measures that China takes domestically to give its exporting companies access to virtually free capital, to underpriced land, to underpriced imports, to tax rebates and the value-added tax when they export. Just a vast array of things that do affect their price competitiveness.
Are Chinese firms getting an unfair advantage?
I think that a lot of these things really warrant careful scrutiny. In the U.S. Congress, the focus tends to be on the value of the renminbi. I, in fact, think that's a minor part of the equation. There are other factors that are much more important in shaping the overall trade balance between the U.S. and China. And I think that the Chinese ought to pull back on some of the things that they've been doing that effectively make their firms less efficient but more competitive.
Are you expecting Chinese firms to now look outwards to, say, try to expand to the U.S. market?
Well, Chinese firms already are looking outwards. If you look at Chinese foreign investment, is grown by leaps and bounds, and I think the upward trajectory will remain very much in evidence. Most of that is in resource extraction, China going out for oil and various minerals and so forth. Most Chinese manufacturing firms prefer to operate at home because they still see a lot of low-hanging fruit in the domestic market, which is much easier for them to operate in, or go to other third world countries where they can be extremely competitive. Many of them find the U.S. market simply too demanding. Our labor standards, our environmental standards, our safety standards, our product quality standards, our legal requirements, the regulatory environment and so forth, and the media environment scares them off. So I think many think that eventually they want to get into the U.S. market as a direct participant, not simply as an exporter from China. But I think relatively few of them see the U.S. market as accessible at this point, given where they are in their own development.
Do you see China as a global player?
China already has a global impact. It's hard to think of a major global issue. Take, for example, the three that I named earlier: recovery from the global economic crisis, the issue of climate change, and the issue of nuclear proliferation. On all of those issues, China's actions make a big difference. It can be very helpful, or it can be not so helpful. It can be a huge problem. So China has global impact as of now. I think it is still in the early stages of figuring out how to be a global player. It still isn't comfortable yet with what the balance ought to be between following China's very narrowly defined national interests as versus contributing to global common goods, global stability, global rulemaking, global institutions that are vibrant. It certainly does some of all of that, but not much. And I think that there's going to be a period of time before the Chinese get comfortable with the notion that they should not be doing everything just for themselves.
China, though, is still looking inward very much, and presumably that's because it's still a developing country.
Sure. At the moment, they think that their future depends on their economic development. And so everything they do is strongly influenced by their notion of what is needed to continue rapid economic development. Even if you look at their foreign policy, overwhelmingly their foreign policy aims at acquiring mineral and energy resources, at keeping markets open for their exports, and then providing the most narrowly based kind of national security. So it's really overwhelmingly shaped by what they see as their domestic economic requirements. And I think that's going to remain the case for quite a while. It's a struggle to get them to think beyond that, because still in per capita GDP, they rank very low in the world. There are so many capitas that their overall GDP is this year becoming the second largest in the world. But on an individual basis, this is a country with maybe 450 million people who are living a relatively modern life, and over 800 million people who are not. And their leaders never forget the reality of that 800 million and its implications for the country.
The US, though, would like to see China as being a major player on the international stage.
Oh, absolutely. I think Barack Obama's view is very simple on this, very pragmatic, that it is hard to think of a major global issue that does not become more manageable if the US and China either can cooperate or at least can act in parallel fashion on it. It's hard to think of a major global issue that doesn't become less manageable if the US and China really act at cross purposes on it. He wants these issues to go better. He certainly wants to be able to work effectively with China. He isn't ideological about it. If there's no way to work effectively with China, he'll find other ways to go about things. But it's been clear in every way since he became president that he would like to see a very effective working relationship with China, and frankly would like over time to develop better trust with China.
Given that the US is deeply indebted, and given the trade imbalance with China, does China then have the upper hand?
Actually, I don't think so. I think let's take the indebtedness issue. China is the largest single holder of US Treasuries and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt, or sovereign debt and agency debt. But in each of those categories of debt, China holds under 7% of the outstanding debt. It has been reducing its rate of purchase of new debt, and still the US is floating a lot of new debt at nearly zero interest rate and having no trouble selling it. So I think the reality is that we are mutually dependent here. The Chinese park their US dollar holdings in US debt instruments and have a huge interest in the US managing its economy effectively so that the US dollar, for example, doesn't go off a cliff in terms of value, doesn't get inflated away in terms of value. And at the same time, the US, while it has a lot of other folks who are willing to invest in its debt, obviously wants to continue to be attractive to Chinese investment. So this is a situation where each depends on the other. to say that China has the upper hand, in fact, if you were talking about real leverage here, I think the Chinese cannot feasibly exit from their U.S. Debt investments in any short period of time on a large scale. It's just impossible for them. So they're really the ones more depending on the U.S. side than the other way around. We can spread our sources of purchasers of our debt more easily, I believe, than they can get out of their investments in our debt. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. The way to think about it is we both have a serious interest in maintaining the confidence of the other in this relationship.
You've been studying the Chinese political system for decades. How do you see the system developing? Is the Chinese Communist Party still relevant today?
The Chinese Communist Party runs China today, so it's absolutely relevant. It's core to the way the place operates. But I think if the Chinese Communist Party were named according to what it actually is, as versus its historical identity, it would be called the Chinese Bureaucratic Capitalist Party. In other words, this is a party that that intervenes massively in the Chinese economy at a microeconomic level, at an enterprise level, not simply monetary and fiscal policy, law and regulation, and sectoral policy. This is enterprise by enterprise at various levels of the Chinese political system. If you look at the reward structure and promotion structure within this Chinese Communist Party, it rewards overwhelmingly those party members who are the most effective at growing the GDP of the area under their jurisdiction. So you get some of the best entrepreneurs in China are the key people in what is still called the Chinese Communist Party. So the party is core. The party does an enormous amount. It's just not communist. It also, by the way, is not free market capitalist either. It's bureaucratic capitalist on a very, very large scale.
How do you see things developing politically?
Well, I think no one really knows how things are going to develop politically. I think that the economic model that China has pursued so enormously successfully over the last 30 years, or that's developed over the last 30 years, now needs to evolve in a serious way. And that evolution requires substantial structural reform in the way the party and the government deal with the economy. That's going to take a lot of political willpower at the top in order to bring about those structural reforms, because frankly the reforms, if they're done right, will reduce the opportunities for local level corruption of officials and therefore reduce the money that they have at their fingertips. That's hard to do in any political system. We'll have to see whether the Chinese can do it or not. If they can, the cost, I think, will be slower growth and increasing instability and, frankly, a less sustainable economy overall. I hope they do well on this, but it's going to be tough, and we'll have to wait and see.
Professor Lieberthal of the Brookings Institution, thanks for joining us.
Well, my pleasure. Good to be here.